Thank you so much, Dr. Shams, for a very thought-provoking and rich talk. And also, I think I do applaud you for your great choice of poems, not just your own, but also Muhammad Ardahali. I really like that poem of her. Okay, so I think, if I may, I want to ask a question, not taking too much of the time, and then I will start moderating. I think your work is full of different layers and different things that really make me think. I teach Rabe. And that's he's really got me engaged. And I'm also thinking here of the sort of the works that has been done on this sort of historical construction of Rabe by, I think, Cornell and also Safura Nurbakhsh. They have both talked about this sort of mythical construction almost of Rabe. And I was wondering, in that terms, it seemed to me that there are poems of her that are not proven to be hers. Karl Ernst seems to be on. So I was just wondering if about these three poems, and how do you know? Because I think your broader point is that we have to read their voice and we have to read their poems and we have to listen to their voice. But the problem with Rabe is that it's not even clear if she has written these poems, because her conception of love is sometimes so, bodily and corporeal and sometimes super abstract. So I was just wondering about that one thing. And then my second question, and I will stop, is that you seem to oscillate between two conceptions of gender. One is socially constructed and performative, which is that of Butler, and then the other is Ahmed Irigaray and Siksu, who are sort of phenomenological, and they sort of lean towards saying that there is a feminine body, and that feminine body does react in particular ways, such as your example of the feminine snap is very phenomenological. And then I'm just wondering, how does that tension between a socially constructed understanding of gender and a phenomenological one sort of I was wondering if you could speak to that tension a little bit.
Thank you for these questions. They're wonderful questions. And I agree with you. And I think one of the challenges in general to work on women poetry, especially poets such as Rabi'eh, is exactly the historical documentations and the sort of, this sort of constant obscurity and ambiguity of whether or not this work belongs to them. And this applies also to other poets. I think Rabe is not the only one. And I think that exactly is one of the issues that should be problematized in the whole rewriting. If we are rewriting the history of women poets, I think one thing to keep in mind is that we cannot be sure at the end of the day whether or not these poems in fact are written by these women. Because the only way to know that is to, again, going back, drawing on the all-male historiography in order to get to the core of the question. And there is no clear answer. That's basically what I'm trying to say, is that how do I know these poems belong to her? I honestly don't know. If I want to give you like a answer that is clear like the bride of the day, and I think the only way that I know it is based on the canonization of her poems. These poems are in anthologies that are well known, for example, so far, and they are also taken from the anthologies, the two major anthologies in the contemporary period. One is the Shakiba one, and the other one is the name is now actually the name of the anthology itself is escaping my mind. But basically, these are the poems, and then from those anthologies, the anthology that just recently came out, and these poems are taken from them. In general, I think we only know that maybe around 55 lines by Rabe is apparently available, maybe less, maybe more. Some say that 7 ghazals, some say only 2 ghazals. So yes, there are very ambiguous in terms of whether or not they belong to her. But there seems to be a consensus on these poems that I've shared, and that's why I remain, and that's why writing on Rabe and talking about Rabe is actually quite difficult. It's she's, and as I mentioned many times in the paper, she is more like a mythologized figure than anything else. And we have to address the construction of her identity before getting to her own poetry. Regarding your second question, which is an excellent question about the notion of gender, right? As far as the gender itself is concerned, I was hoping to actually have clarified this throughout my talk, that I am basically leaning towards the Butlerian sense of gender, which is because I also draw on the notion of performativity in her work. But in reading the poems themselves, so the notion of gender, meaning like if we are talking about gender identity and the gender categorization of women poets, in that sense, I'm using the Butlerian concept. But in reading the poems themselves, or the acts that the women poets in general, their actions, the way that they approach to basically their own positioning, I think the phenomenological aspect would be useful in the reading of the poems themselves. I was hoping to have clarified that in my talk, but apparently I have not. But basically, what I'm trying to get at is that when we are looking at the categorizations and anthologizations, I think the Butlerian sense of gender is very helpful as an unfixed, fluid, sort of ever-changing concept, that woman is always, as a man, is always sort of a category that is evolving, and we can't really set on stone what this gender is and how and to define it. I think that's helpful as far as the anthologization of the women are concerned. But I think when it comes to the way in which women themselves, for example, the poems that I was talking about, and in the analysis of the poems, the phenomenological view could be helpful to understand the poems. But I understand that might actually create a tension, theoretically speaking. I hear your point, and I will think about that. Thank you for bringing that up.
No, I mean, it's a tough one to sort of navigate. But thank you so much for the response. So I think we have I see two hands, Razak Khan and then Shaheen Pishbin after that. Is it okay if we take two questions and then come back to you?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Yeah, please.
Thank you so much for this beautiful and lyrical talk. I guess I want to follow up with this very difficult question that has been so nicely raised by the moderator, because I think that has some implication, given you provide actually a far more interesting case. So I'm here thinking of three subject possibility. There's, of course, the female woman poet. Then there is the project of the feminist poetess, which a lot of women's studies scholarship has been interested in recuperating. And then there's the feminine subject. Now, going by the Lacanian sense, which I'm glad that you raised, we are then confronted with a whole set of other questions. Now, given your own work as a poetess, and I was more interested in thinking of literary subjecthood over gendered personhood, and what that might do to our sense of what I think in some way is a limitation of gender studies with this total emphasis on performativity. What are the constraints under which literary performance happens? So I'm just trying to sort of push you on this tension, given Persian language, it is itself in terms of gendered possibility is far more complex. So I guess to sort of summarize, my question is to go back to the moderator's point and to think again with this three subject possibility within the woman poetess, the female, feminine, and the feminist subject duplication, and how that really always is the challenge, given the historiography is largely male.
Right. I'm trying to sort of understand the question. What I tried to do in this talk was to show how this gender identity has been constructed, right? And how this gender identity has been constructed in the works, in the posthumous works by other historians, poets, how they defined Rabe, how they saw Rabe. I consider that to be a gendered process in the Butlerian sense, because it's not a sort of, why do I say that? And because when you go back to her work and try to understand her work, you see that the gender in her work, the gender identity in her work doesn't exactly ascribe, that doesn't exactly confirm those depictions. So in that sense, when going back to Dr. Gahan's question, in that sense, I consider the gender to be a fluid and unfixed phenomenon, as far as these categorizations and portrayals are concerned, right? Meaning that we can't, at the end of the day, we end up with a confusion in the sense that we can't exactly decide which Rabe was exactly Rabe. Was the mystical Rabe? Was the non-mystical Rabe? Was it both? Could we actually come close to sort of a gender identity based on her own poetry, the portrayal of herself as a woman who leaned towards both mystical and non-mystical? I think the answer to that question is that, again, going back to the first question that Dr. Gahan asked, is the lack of access to enough poetry by her. But from what I showed, and I hope to show in this short lyric poems that I discussed, I think what we get at is that if that feminine subject that you're talking about, the subjectivity, that's another way of articulating the same idea, is that the kind of feminine subjectivity that you see in her work, in my view, is different from what you see in her depictions afterwards. And that's basically what I try to discuss and what I try to show. In terms of engaging with Lacan, the main reason, the main sort of concern to draw on Lacan, I know that, for example, Julia Kristeva has, which, you know, whose work actually has been very inspiring, although I also have issues with her work. But as far as Lacan's work in here is concerned, I think what the notion of the symbolic order and the paternal economy are extremely helpful when we are talking about the language itself. Because the question of imitation, like this concern that constantly has been raised by, or critic rather, by the scholars and critics in the field with reference to works of medieval poets, such as Jahan Malek Khatun, to be imitators mostly of the masculine language. I take issue with that view. You see, I take issue from the Lacanian perspective, because if you consider the language itself to be phallocentric, then you cannot talk about imitation. You can talk about rupture. And that's what I was hoping to get at, that, you know, yes, in that rupture, there might be imitation, but first and foremost, it's a rupture. And I think we should recognize that and acknowledge that rupture. Yeah. Thanks. I hope that I answered your question.
Thank you for your response. Shaheen Pishbin, please go ahead.
Hi, thank you, Professor Shams. Wonderful talk. I really enjoyed it. I was really interested by one of the comments you made, where you said Rabia has been associated with a particular style as a precursor to a particular stylistic school, the Tarz of Vasucht or the Maktab of Vasucht.
Have not been.
Oh, you said she has not been.
She has not been, but what I said is that the Vasucht comes in the 15th century, but we can see that she is one of the pioneers in that style, even way before that the style was actually recognized as a school of poetry. That's what I thought.
Okay. Yeah, no, because I mean, I wonder what your thinking is about positioning her, like how do you understand that particular style within her poetry, and whether maybe that's a way of thinking about, you know, how she belongs to a stylistic school or a literary tradition outside of gendered ways of canonizing her, either as a Sufi or as just a woman poet, and if that's the kind of argument you're getting at.
Yeah, so basically thank you, this is a wonderful question, Shaheen, and it's good to see you here. Thank you for coming. The point that you're making, that I try to also make, not just about this loathing the beloved, which is basically the center point of the Vasucht sort of approach to love poetry, right? There is a turn in the Vasucht school where poets start, and there are many different reasons, speculations about why this happens, why this sort of turn towards the ma'shuq happens, that the loathing of the beloved. I think what is interesting my point was not exactly stylistic, was mostly conceptual, and this approach to the beloved and the way that the beloved is treated, which is, I think, has very close affinity with the Vasucht style. But what I was trying to say is that we can find traces of these very different styles and schools of poetry that happens later on, and then we kind of categorize them as if they are separate categories. I also don't think that those categorizations, I also take issue with that kind of categorization of literature as like Khorasani style and Iraqi style, as if there is no overlap. But I think if we sort of move away from the gendered categorization, we can find qualities in Rabia's poetry that speak to all these different schools and styles. And in that sense, then that Lacanian point about language that we were talking about, I think becomes relevant in the sense that she intervenes in that symbolic by introducing concepts and metaphors. I also talked about the shoreless sea, Daryay Bikaran Ishq, which is something that Sanai frequently references. And actually, he has been credited, as you know well, as sort of the founder, the father of the mystical verse. And for most of, he takes the credit for most of these metaphors. The first, much earlier than Sanai, you can find the metaphor in Rabia's poetry. That has nothing to do, again, with the Vasucht style, right? But what I'm saying is that if we move away from the gender categorization, we can see the poems written by these women with a much broader and, in my view, interesting and refreshing scope. But yeah, just to clarify, I didn't say that she's associated with the Vasucht, because Vasucht happens much later as a school, but you can see the footprints of that in her poetry, I think.
Thank you so much. Now, Bahar Davari, please go ahead with your question.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Shams, for a wonderful talk. It was totally new to me, even though I have read Tazkirat al-Awliya 1,000 times, especially the section on Rabia and Margaret Smith's work. This idea that Rabia was not a mystic is something that I would like to pursue with you. And I appreciate the idea that there are different positions on any individual, especially when they lived so long ago. You made me go and get my Tazkirat al-Awliya from my shelf and read again where it says Hasan be Rabia goft rغبت کنی تا نکاحی کنیم و عقد بندیم. گفت عقد نکاح بر وجودی فرو آید. اینجا وجود برخواسته است که نیست خودم. So the claim that Rabia was not a mystic, according to this account of Attar, could be highly suspicious. My question is, does Attar contradict himself in Elahé Nameh? Elahé Nameh was one of the sources that you indicated where the first possibly honors killing came through. That's the part of the story of Rabia that I've never heard. So I would like if you would speak a little bit about that part of the story, if you would. Thank you.
So Ms. Tawari, I just want to clarify one thing. The part that I mentioned about Tazkiratul Awliya was in reference to Rabia Adawiyeh. She's a different mystic woman than Rabia Quzdari, who was the subject of my talk. So I just want to clarify that.
Right.
And I didn't say that Attar doesn't, in fact, I said that in Elahé Nameh, Attar concludes that Rabia Balkhi is a mystic. I didn't say that he says that she was not a mystic. The non-mystical Rabia, as I said, which again is the term used by Professor Sonal Sharma in his article From Ayesha to Nur Jahan, that non-mystical sort of approach or description or depiction of Rabia comes through Lewab al-Albab Ofi. And that was a separate argument that I was making. In this gendered construction of Rabia, we have two different approaches. One is the mystical approach and one is the non-mystical approach. And Attar, in fact, falls within the mystical category, mystification of Rabia. So if I wasn't clear enough on that, I just wanted to clarify that. Also, I referred to Elahé Nameh and Tazkiratul Awliya, as you mentioned. I referenced Elahé Nameh with reference to Rabia Balkhi, and I mentioned Tazkiratul Awliya as far as Rabia Adawiyeh is concerned. It's very, I know that it's a very tricky comparison. They have been actually mixed up and confused with each other pretty often. But there are two different people, like two different women. One is in fact in Basra in Iraq, and the other one is in so there are two different women.
Thank you for clarifying.
Sure. Thank you for your question.
Thank you, Mohammad, and then Pegah Shahbaz, please.
Professor Shams, thank you for your very rich presentation, and it will be really a guide to me as we think of the whole category of women poets. But I see also, as Jayran noted, a tension in your presentation. The way you describe the whole project, it's really constitutes gender as a historical, dynamic, transformative category. And then on occasions, you say move away from gender, because in a sense, this tightrope, this dilemma, the impasse, it's really an important component of the process, the rich reading that you bring in, how love is sublimated and then later on desublimated. So you have a historical process. Rabia is not a one person fixed in time, unchanging over time, but is dynamic, historical, and changing. And you also, through this process of desublimation, by bringing back to our attention the physicality of the love, actually adding another layer to that historicity. In a sense, what I'm wanting to get is that sometimes people during the conversation that we have they say, oh, just treat everyone as poets. These are not, don't talk about women poets. This is a false category to use. But then we will lose this rich historicization that you offered. That tension, that tight rope enables us to historicize, to explain, to theorize in a way that will enable us to see the entire process of canonization, marginalization, demarginalization, and really recovering a woman's voice in Persian literary tradition.
Thank you, Dr. Tawakkoli. So I just want to clarify that, as I mentioned before the talk in our conversation, my aim here is not to cancel the category. I just want to clarify that. My aim is to problematize it and to shake it. I think the way that we look at gender and the way that we understand gender as far as the women poets are concerned has to change. And the gender itself has to be reevaluated and redefined and reviewed, revisited. I think what we have so far, if I want to go back to basically what I said at the very beginning, linguistically, if you want to conceptually, if you want to sort of put it into language, it would be what we have right now is mostly feminine versus masculine. I think we have to move away from that. So if you're using the woman poet category as a feminine voice, as a feminine category, that's what I take issue with. But I still consider the woman poets category to be valid and to be extremely important and timely. As far as our understanding of gender moves away from the rigid categorizations of sex based on femininity and masculinity, which are the attributes, the cultural attributes given based on the sexual, biological sex at the time of birth. They're basically imposed on you by the social construct. In raftar zanane ast, in raftar mardan ast. This behavior is feminine, that behavior is masculine. I think that's the issue here. And I hoped to at least open up the discussion. So what I'm moving away from is not gender, again, in its Butlerian sense, which is an unfixed process, but from the rigid feminine versus masculine binary, or sex. Some scholars also use sex categorization as a way to address it. The language can.
Thank you.
If I may ask my question. Yes, thank you very much, Professor Shams, for your very stimulating talk. I would like to return to the narratives about Rabi'eh by Ufi and then by Abalkhair and Attar. These are narratives narrated by men, as you said, but I would like to draw attention to the cultural filters that these narrators had. Ufi was not a mystic, was not known as a mystical person, but Abalkhair and Attar are. Ufi traveled to India and served the Sultanate of Delhi, produced books for the Sultanate, for the Ghurids, okay? And actually the image, the admired image of the woman in Indian and Indo-Persian culture is very much different from the admired image of the woman in the Persian culture of Central Asia. So we have to somehow distinguish. Even the image presented in the Sufi Indo-Persian literature produced in South Asia is different from the one we find in Central Asian literary productions. The Indian woman in Indian narratives, the one who is admired is the one who outdoes men, who laughs at them, who gives them a mocking laughter, who has a freedom of speech in expressing love. And she's admired for not having any fear of social judgments. And this is exactly expressed in what we see in Ufi's paragraph. Agarche zan bud be fazl bar mardan jahan bekhandidi. And then he admires Rabi'eh for his zaka khatir, for his intelligence, what could be perceived as makr or ruse, or guile and negative in Central Asian Persian culture will be seen as smartness and intelligence in the Indo-Persian one. And then پیوسته عشق باختی و شاهد بازی کردی. In South Asian devotional literature, women who abandon their husbands for their beloved, for the true love that they have for their beloved outside the marital agreement, are praised by Sufi poets, even in Persian. So I would like to suggest you have a look at Ufi's other works, such as Jawami al-Hikayat, which he produced in Delhi, actually. He had, in the 4th chapter, if I'm not mistaken, he has translated stories about women from Indian, he has actually included, I'm not sure if he translated it, but he included Indian narratives around women in his work, and he also provides a categorization of the different types of women. So that would help to clarify the ideal image of the woman that Ufi had, and the one that people like Attar or Abu Khair had in the, let's say, 12th and 13th centuries Central Asia. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Chavos. This is very illuminating and very helpful. I appreciate that you sort of expanded the notion of female, I believe, feminine aesthetic, if I may call it, which again wasn't exactly the focus here, but I can see why you're getting at what you're getting at, and I completely agree with you that this sort of aestheticization, beautification of women according to the male gaze could be also a subject that vary if we look at, for example, the documents of the historical documents and tazkiras, and not tazkiras, but sort of the works that have talked about women or depicted women in different particular geographies of the Persian world. I completely agree with you that depiction could change and vary when we compare them. My goal here was not so much to compare and contrast the mystics and the non-mystic, sort of not the Ofi with like Abu Said and Abu Khair. I was mostly interested in their construction of Rabi'eh. Also, I take all the points that you mentioned about the aesthetics of women and so forth, but my question still lingers in the back of my head and I can't help it. And that's the conjunction that is used in there, agar che zan bud. There is a distinction, there is a differentiation, and that distinction, I think, is important to be addressed in the language. Why being a woman raises the eyebrows and sort of the question or the surprise that although she was a woman, she was capable of doing this. I think there is an inherent sort of gaze in there that you can't really negate, even if you say that, okay, this, the way that he's looking and he's understanding the feminine beauty and intelligence is based on a completely different set of values. I still think that the sentence lends itself to a critical inquiry as far as the gendered construction of Rabi'eh is concerned. I will definitely look into sources about the aesthetics of female depiction in the Indian subcontinent during this period, and thank you for that. I hope that my answer at least addressed part of the question, that which part of Ofi's depiction that I was trying to explain, which is that rare female species that, you know, being intelligent and witty and at the same time being sexually flirtatious and chasing boys. I also didn't know that mystic poets of India, is that what you're saying? They admired extramarital affairs. I was wondering if you can give at least one example.
Yes, there are many actually. Stories from Punjab, Hirancha, for example. Well, if you read different variations of even Lady Majnun, Khosrow, Shirin, the stories that we know, the way they are elaborated by Indian poets, Persian poets, is very much different from the one that we know by Jami or by Nizami. They somehow shift the view. The woman character is not passive, is not the beloved. She turns out to be the actor, the lover, the person who takes risks and accepts all the difficulties and the path in order to reach her true beloved, who is a man, actually. And the Sufis and Sufi poets in South Asia gave credit to this woman, actually. They did not, how can we say, they did not demonize such a woman. This is a negative image that we have in the Islamic mystical literary culture in Iran and Central Asia. But in South Asia, we have a, let's say, more tolerating, let's say, or more liberating view towards these relationships. The poets there give more credit to the truthfulness of love rather than it gets out of Sharia boundaries, let's say.
Interesting. Yeah, I wonder how much though we can stretch to that part of the Persian world as far as Rabia is concerned, given that she was the victim of honor killing. So that's something that your point is fascinating, and I have to admit I haven't read this work that worked on by the Indian poets. I'm mostly working on the modern literature, but it's very interesting. But I just wonder to what extent we can actually categorize Rabia or her personality based, or her life on the account of these poets, so the way that they actually approached women. She was mostly, Ofi has a very short biography for Rabia compared to her male counterpart also. And she's the only woman poet actually that he categorizes in that 2-volume giant biography of poets at Taskera. She's the only woman poet. She's really subject mostly to the mythical categorization and canonization. And even today in Afghanistan, she's known as a Sufi saint, and she has a shrine, and people go to her shrine. So that has been really I would say the dominant construct, sort of identity that has been constructed for her after her death than the Ofi's one.
Thank you, Dr. Shams, for bearing with us. We have, I think, one last question, and then we can conclude the session. Raza Khan, please go ahead.
I just want to follow on this example given about the Indian subcontinent and its creation of the woman outside of marriage. The problem still remains the same. So we have two narratives. One is creation of women as Sufis, or then they're being celebrated outside of marriage. Either way, it is production of womanhood through male
Exactly.
idea. Yeah.
Yes.
So
Absolutely.
either way, so what I wanted to come back to was, I think what you raised is a very important comparison of Rabia with Farrukhzad. And I'm wondering, Farrukhzad referenced this because the choice there are either mystical or this Sufi sublimated category, or you are this sinful. And sin, I thought, was a wonderful word. This is a word that is often actually recuperated by women. So one might call it Sarah Ahmed's women's snap is in fact sin that's being used by Farooq. So now the question then is, and I'm yet thinking of your early engagement with Kristeva and even Gayatri Spivak, the woman here is not a stable category. She's literally being produced in this displacement from Sufi to the sinner.
Absolutely.
Now, so in that context, now, I think, I suppose I don't have a question, but your material is rich and it is sort of cannot be answered only through gendered agency argument. I think you're right in terms of thinking about the gender of the language and the phallic nature of the language and criticism itself, rather than focusing on the poet's bodily identity, which is what the Lacanian argument would be, that it is the relationship with the phallic, and phallic being in this case language, that sort of then marks our relationship with desire, erotic, or mysticism. So sorry for this long pandering, but I think you might be doing something really interesting here. And I'm just wondering if you could say something about this displacement between mystical and the sinful woman.
This is absolute. Thank you so much. I would love to continue this discussion after. Maybe not today, but I would be more than happy to correspond with you. I would love you to read this is the very first draft of the paper that I've written for this particular event. So it's, as I mentioned at the beginning, the thoughts are still very much in process. Nothing is set on stone, and I'm still grappling with the theoretical ideas also. And what you're saying is really interesting, and I think very, very important. What I'm trying to do here is exactly what you said at the end, right? To without aiming to create a category of Sufi versus sinful woman, because as Ms. Shahbaz said, it's at least Ofi's account. It doesn't depict Rabe as a sinful woman. He actually creates my interest is that why did it matter to Ofi that why did he care about Rabe's being a boy chaser or flirtatious woman? Why he doesn't write a single word about any of the male poets that they chased a woman for that they chased women? That's just a curious question that I had, and it could be that it had to do with his interest and aesthetics coming from India or traveling to India and so forth. But as you rightly mentioned, and I think that's also a response to Ms. Shahbaz's point, is that again, no matter what aesthetics they're following, it's still a male depiction of a female poet at the end, and then in terms of the category of the sinful and the Sufi, I think this category, especially if we think about Forough Farrokhzad and Rabe'eh, it definitely is a category, it's a binary that makes a lot of sense, right? But what I was trying to say was that to go back to the idea that gender itself is not fixed and it changes. We can see this change and this evolution from Rabe'eh to Forough Farrokhzad. Again, they are both women poets. They are both talking about acts of transgression, love as an act of transgression. But the way that they put that into language, the way that they verbalize that, of course, is different. Their relationship with the phallic basically has changed. if we consider gender to be constructed as the in relation to the phallic, right? That changes, that evolves, and that evolution is very interesting. And that's where I think the category of women poets need to be revisited, in the sense that we put all these women in the same category, but they're also very different from each other as far as their understanding of their own gender identities.
Thank you, Dr. Shams. I don't know if you have the stamina to do another question, or if we could.
Sure.
Yes, you want to? Okay. All right. This is the last one then. Shahzadeh, I'm sorry, I can't read your last name, but please go ahead with your question.
Samarkandi, isn't she?
Samarkandi. I don't know. I can't. My screen is not showing the full name.
Yeah, so. It's me, Shahzadeh Samarkandi. Thank you so much for a very interesting talk and subject. I've enjoyed it very much. My question is, have you ever analyzed the mentioning of Attar about Rabia as a gesture to save her in a patriarchal society, as a mystical poet? Otherwise she would have been forgotten, and we would not have this chance to talk about her.
Well, I think, yes, go ahead, please.
And my other question was that, and to Ms. Shahbaz's point as well, that women in Central Asia have been suppressed for so long due to the matriarchal society. And women were the ones who opposed the Islamic culture, because in Central Asia we had many strong women who were queens, who were ruling the lands and countries, and due to that, women until now are being kept away from education to suppress their power, their maternity power, their natural power. But that was my point, but my question was the first one.
Right. Thank you, Shahzadeh, for this question and for being here also. So you see, I have a problem with the word saving women. This is a history that, of course, if it wasn't, in a way, if it wasn't told by men, many of these women would have been forgotten. Sure, in that sense, that they have the fact that they are documented. I guess we have to thank male historiographers, Mr. Ofi and others, for doing that. I also mentioned in terms of questions, in the form of questions, when I was talking about Abu Saida Abul Khair, I think that they definitely thought that they're saving her. And I think you can actually see that in the language, in the tone of Abu Saida Abul Khair's anecdote, and also you can see that in Elahé Nameh, you can see that in Reza Quli Khan Hidayat's Bakhtashnameh also. I think, and let's not forget that both Attar and Reza Quli Khan Hidayat, and third actually, and Jami, they all are drawing on one, Sufi mystic called Abu Saida Abul Khair. And Abu Saida Abul Khair's work also is subject to question, like which parts of his work that really belong to him, what didn't belong to him. That also is something to for another talk. But what I'm trying to say here is that in a way, Attar, Jami, Reza Quli Khan Hidayat, all of these are drawing on one thing that Abu Saida Abul Khair has said. And as I mentioned in my talk, I actually read those questions, that from the defensive tone of Abu Saida Abul Khair's anecdote, one could actually wonder that is he trying to defend her? Is he trying to purify her from a sin that was considered to be basically a shameful sin for a woman having an affair with a man, right? And you can see that the way that he goes about it is also through her poetry, although he doesn't mention any particular poem by Rabi'eh, but says from the poetry that was heard from her tongue, we cannot believe in the fact that she was in love with an earthly human being. My point here is something else, though. She has survived in the mystic tradition and in the Persian tradition, thanks to this way of, thanks to their words, thanks to their attention to her. But that doesn't mean that we cannot criticize the way that they canonized her. The way in which they are canonized could be still open to question and criticism, right? And that's what I was trying to get at. Of course, if it wasn't because of Attar's Elahé Nameh, we probably didn't know the story, the details of the story. It's as simple as that. So, and also, when I say Attar is part of the category of mystifying Rabi'eh, I also tried to clarify, although there wasn't enough time, is that there is a complicated image of Rabi'eh in Attar's Elahé Nameh. He is also the one, as I mentioned at the beginning of my talk, he is also the one who gives credit to Rabi'eh and her poetry as being memorized and recited by Rudaki. So that changes our perception of the canon formation, in fact, that if she's the one who is being memorized and remembered and recited in her bodily absence, then who is more important, Rudaki or Rabi'eh? Or maybe not like that kind of, not that who is more important, but she is equally as important as Rudaki. That's not the way the canon has been written. And I think Attar's Elahé Nameh gives us a really good clue about how important her poetry was, being memorized by the best poet of the Samanid court, Rudaki, being recited and also applauded by the crowd in the court. Said a lot about the quality of her poetry. So yeah, sure. I mean, by no means I'm trying to say that all these male poets are canonizing this woman in such and such way. There is it's complicated, and
sure, it is.
Yeah.
If I mention, if I have, I don't know, time. If you're not tired, Rudaki, when they wanted to give Rudaki a laqab, Maliku Shu'ara, they said no. There is someone who writes better than you. And that's why Rudaki goes to Balkh to meet Rabi'eh. And he approves it and comes back to the court. There's a saying, I'm not sure it has I don't know, we can prove it or not. But Rudaki goes to meet Rabi'eh and comes back with her poetry, with a bunch of her poetry, and reads it all by heart to present her at the court. But the mistake he makes, Rudaki, knowingly or not knowingly, he mentions about her love affair. The fact is that we don't know about the love affairs of Rudaki himself, but he, knowing this sensitivity of the subject, he talks about it in an open meeting in the court where her brother reads it.
Yes,
where her brother is also there. The point is, people around Rabi'eh were admiring her, keeping her affair in secret, but Rudaki just makes it all open, and it causes Rabi'eh her life, basically. And that's why Attar is trying to compensate that. in my opinion.
So actually, what you're saying about Horace finding out about his sister's love affair through Rudaki is also something that Attar writes about in Elahé Nameh. In the section that he talks about the story, he also says that there was a dorge actually through that dorge in his poetry that he was reciting in front of Horace, he finds out. So again, this saying that you're mentioning has been again documented. But again, let me just clarify this. We do not know to what extent the story that Attar is telling us is historically documented. We don't know if it's actually accurate. We don't know if he is, to some extent, to what extent he's allegorizing it, to what extent he's metaphorizing it and adding details into it. He doesn't give us any clue about how he knows the story. So it could very well be like the Mantiqut and the Simorgh and the birds and the stories that, some of the stories that are fictional there too. And that's where the notion of fictive womanhood actually becomes really, I think, relevant and helpful in our discussions, is that to what extent this womanhood that has been depicted as far as Rabeh is concerned is fictive, and to what extent it's accurate. That's also a question that is important to be addressed. Thank you so much for all these questions. I appreciate that.
Thank you all for a very, very lively discussion. I love the fact that we ended on the note of the desire of the historian to find out the truth, and then here we're trying to find the desire of Rabeh. So thank you so much, Dr. Shams, for a very provocative and thought-provoking talk, and thank you everybody for this really wonderful event.
I want to join Jayron to thank you, Professor Shams, for your really, truly thought-provoking and destabilizing kind of discussion. Great potential. I look forward to reading the article, and with historicizing the gender category in poetry, I think is an amazing work. And thank you, Professor Gahan, for moderating such an interesting session. Thank you. And thank you all for joining us from all over the world.